Okay, so I'm going to start by asking a question. Has anybody ever seen a female crash test dummy? And that's because until recently, there never existed one. Most crash test dummies in the world are based on Reference Man. Reference Man is a superhero. He is 177 centimeters tall and has a weight of about 76 kilograms. And Reference Man, his superpower is to represent all of humanity. So what happens when Reference Man represents all of humanity in car crash test scenarios? Well, women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured in a car accident, 71% more likely to be moderately injured, and 17% more likely to die in a car accident. There's actually a term for women in the car industry, and it's called out-of-position drivers. We tend to be shorter, so we end up leaning forward to peer over the dashboard. We sit closer to the steering wheel. We have we carry less muscle in our necks and our backs, which makes us more prone to whiplash in the case of a rear side accident. And so after years and years of lobbying and convincing people, finally the EU and the US has agreed to use female crash test dummies. They started in 2011, only tested in passenger seats, so they assume that women don't drive. They use scaled-down male dummies, so they're not really anatomically correct. And when they introduced this, it sent US cars rating plummeting. So I haven't introduced my topic or myself, but I think you know what direction I'm heading in. My name is Michelle D'Souza. I'm on the Voltron team. I am hired out of the Calgary office, but I spend most of my time in Brazil. I do fly up here a few times a year. My topic for today is called Invisible Women, the Gender Data Gap. Invisible Women is the story of what happens when half of humanity is not represented in key decision making when it comes to things like urban planning, product design, workplace conditions, and so on. And this is just, I'm going to throw a lot of data out here. And I haven't been able to really stitch a story together, but there is an underlying theme around all the examples that I'm going to share today. So another observation is when it comes to police vests, only 5% of women said that their vests never hampered their work. This is not just police vests, this is all sort of protective equipment like hazmat suits, boots, helmets, and so on. In 1997, a female British police officer was stabbed and killed when she was trying to use a hydraulic ram to enter an apartment. She had taken off her body armor because it was getting in the way, and as a result, ended up getting stabbed and killed. 2 years after that, another female British police officer said that she had to surgically augment her body in order to fit into these police vests. And when these reports started coming out, about 700 female police officers said that they've been bruised by their kit belts, that they don't feel protected in the body armor, they can't even fit into it, and a lot of them have had physiotherapy as a result of police vests not fitting properly. Finally, a few municipalities around the world are making police vests that are more suitable for women and fit properly, but still this change is taking time. This story just kind of landed in my lap as I was doing research. In mid-March, NASA announced that they were going to do their first all-female spacewalk. It was going to be on March 29th, 2019. There was a press release and everyone was excited about it. Women have done spacewalks before, but they've always been accompanied by male astronauts. So this was going to be the first all-female spacewalk. However, the day before, one of the astronauts, Anne McClain, canceled the spacewalk. She had been using a different spacesuit to do her spacewalks, and then the last one that she did, she realized that the medium-sized spacesuit was the one that fit her better, and she felt more secure in it, and for her own safety, she said, I would like to use the medium-sized spacesuit. Christina Koch, who was the other astronaut at the time, she was using a medium-sized spacesuit. Well, it turns out the International Space Station only has one medium-sized spacesuit. So both women could not use that, and hence the all-female spacewalk was canceled. Christina Koch went ahead and did the spacewalk and was accompanied by her colleague, who's a male astronaut. On further research, it was discovered that the International Space Station did not even have small-sized spacesuits, which rule out about 80% of women in the world. So it goes to show that even, an organization as brilliant as NASA did not account for one day just team of all female astronauts being able to do spacewalks. Oh, actually, before I went to that, I actually have to ask you a question. So this is equipment and suits and so on, but there's huge gender data gaps in the medical industry as well. So I'm going to now ask you to picture someone getting a heart attack. I know it's a morbid thing to picture, but just work with me here. So if you picture someone getting a heart attack, how many of you picture someone holding their chest in pain? Yeah? And what about like your arm in pain and then, probably collapsing to the ground and taking an aspirin and being rushed to the hospital? This is called the classic Hollywood heart attack. This is where, this is what people assume that all heart attacks look like. However, for women, heart attacks are different. The symptoms, especially for younger women, the symptoms include stomach pain, breathlessness, nausea, and fatigue, which do not coincide with the same symptoms that men display when they have a heart attack. So it leads to a lot of misdiagnosis when women have heart attacks. This actually has a term in the medical industry, and it's called the Yentl syndrome. I don't know how many of you have watched the movie Yentl. I haven't. But in a nutshell, it stars Barbara Streisand, and she's playing a young woman in Poland who dresses up like a man in order to study Jewish theology. And this phenomenon is whereby women who are misdiagnosed and are treated poorly for their disease if they don't display the exact same symptoms as men do. This is with several diseases and conditions, but I picked heart attacks to talk about because it is the leading cause of death of women in the U.S. Following a heart attack, women are more likely to die than men, probably because they're being misdiagnosed and not treated properly. In the UK, women are 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed, and only 1 in 5 physicians are aware that more women die from cardiovascular disease than men. So a heart attack in the medical industry has always been considered a male disease. When even it's studied among groups, it's usually represented by 90% male. Same thing with drug trials. They're conducted on groups which consist of 90% male. So even the drugs that are being administered, we know that they work on men, but nobody knows how effective they are on women. For example, the whole myth of taking an aspirin after is actually more dangerous for women than it is. And it actually helps men, but it doesn't help women. But, no one really puts that information out that hey, if a woman's having a heart attack, don't take an aspirin. The first artificial heart came out in 2013 and is expected to save hundreds and thousands of lives of people who are waiting for new hearts. It is too big for women. The one for women is being worked on right now and is years behind in research. Moving on to the Eastern world, this is a picture of a traditional stove. It's used in rural parts of India, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Over 800 million women use this to cook food every day. It's basically a stove in the middle of the house, and you use firewood, and usually the fires or embers are usually just running throughout the day. Women spend on average 5 to 7 hours making breakfast, lunch, and dinner. What is so special about this? Well, it is equivalent to smoking over 100 cigarettes a day. It causes about 2.9 million deaths per year, 3 times more than malaria, and is the leading killer of children under 5 years old, children who are accompanied, who have to accompany their mothers while they cook. And there's actually a term for this. It's called internal pollution, and I hadn't heard about this until I was actually doing my research. There is tons of funding for external pollution, like deforestation, global warming, and so on. Internal pollution is heavily understudied and underfunded, primarily because it affects rural people and rural women. And yeah, there's a huge gap in getting women to use better, cleaner cooking fuels and cooking methods. But like I said, it's like, 800 million women still use this, and it causes things like lung cancer and respiratory diseases and, of course, death. This is a picture of an LPG gas cylinder. If you go to any middle-class home in India, you'll find one of these. It's liquid petroleum gas, and it's a clean, efficient cooking fuel, heavily subsidized by the Indian government and guaranteed that every household in India should have one, which is great. Yes, they're trying to solve the internal pollution problem. However, an average woman in rural India has to walk about 10 kilometers to get an LPG gas cylinder. And I've tried carrying one of these things, helping my mom drag it into the house, and I can't carry it. So, walking 10 kilometers with carrying this on your head is not really a sustainable option. So there's a huge a data gap here as well as to, okay, we're providing a solution, but you know what, the solution doesn't really work for rural women in India. Moving on to a different topic. So this, I don't know how many people play piano. This is a picture of a DS-78 piano. It was created by a pianist named Christopher Donison, who said that the world can be divided into two constituencies, one for people with smaller hands and one for people with larger hands. The average octave width on a standard piano is about 7.4 inches wide, which disadvantages 87% of adult female pianists in the world. Christopher Donison was born with smaller hands, and while he was playing Chopin for the millionth time, he was like, I can do this my entire life, and I will never be one of the best pianists in the world because I was born with smaller hands. So he made a piano for people with smaller hands, and it's primarily used actually by women pianists. And of course, when he did this, the best pianists in the world poo-pooed this and went, well, no, if you really have talent and you work hard, you can be the best pianist in the world. So they actually did a study of the top 483 pianists in the world. The top 12 have handspans of about 8.8 inches or more, which is a pretty large handspan, and only two there are only two acclaimed female pianists in that group, and they have handspans of 9 and 9.5 inches wide. So yes, hand size actually does make a difference when you want to be one of the best pianists in the world. Sticking with the same theme is form factors on phones. A few years ago, form factors on phones reached the maximum size for women to be able to hold a phone in one hand and use it. Form factors will not grow anymore because they've already reached the maximum handspan for a man to use one-handed. Well, you can say, well, then why don't women use smaller form factors? Well, the thing is, the larger form factor phones have more processing power and better cameras. So one of the things that people are talking to iPhone about is that, just because women have smaller hands doesn't mean we have to compromise on processing power and higher quality cameras. And this, in product design, I know there's a lot of movie references, and it's called the Henry Higgins effect. I don't know how many of you have watched My Fair Lady's classic movie. And Henry Higgins is a character. He's a professor, an English professor, very erudite professor, who meets a woman who is ill-educated and doesn't speak well and trains her to speak English properly, and I think it's part of a bet or something, pass her off as a rich socialite. And one of the most famous songs from this movie, My Fair Lady, is Why Can't a Woman Be More Like a Man? And this is actually a common theme in product design. Well, the products are designed keeping a certain customer in mind, and when women don't meet that kind of criteria, the the thought is, well, there's nothing wrong really with our product. It's that just women are not using it properly. Another example of this is voice control systems on cars. There were voice control systems installed in certain Buicks and Volkswagens that were not responding to women drivers. They were, however, responding to their husbands, even though they were sitting in the passenger seat. So some women actually tried an experiment where they lowered the pitch of their voice and, tried a more bass tone, and suddenly the voice control system started responding to them. So it turns out that the data used to train these voice control systems consisted of 70% male voices and less than 30% female voices. So the systems were trained to recognize more bass voices, and so we're better at responding to male customers rather than female customers. This information was taken to the CEO of that particular brand, and his response was, well, there's nothing really wrong with our product, but we can teach the women to speak in a more bass tone and use our product properly. Another example is the Henry Higgins effect. This is another sequence of data I'm going to throw out there. Until about the 1970s, there were 0 women in the New York City Philharmonic. And even though there were a few blips in the 50s and 60s, it stubbornly stayed at about 0% until the 70s for decades. And then suddenly, in the next 10 years, the number of women jumped from 0 to 10%. And it was just a strange phenomenon because there's very little turnover in the Philharmonic. These are jobs for life. Most musicians, once they get a job, they don't leave or they don't get fired. So what had changed? Well, it had been traced back to blind auditions. The New York City Philharmonic had introduced a thick curtain, so the interviewers never saw who was playing the musical instrument, but were picking people based on how they heard the music being played. So blind auditions started increasing the number of women in the New York City Philharmonic. Today it stands at about 45%, and blind auditions still continue. This is not just in classical music. There was a study done, an experiment done by a tech recruiter in New York called Speak with a Geek, and they sent 5,000 resumes to the same group of employers in 2 different rounds. In the first round, they sent the exact same resumes of the exact same candidates to the exact same group of employers. In the first round, in the 5,000 resumes, they shared information like name and background and so on. The number of women that were picked for interviews was about 5%. In the second round, they sent the exact same resumes to the same employers, and this time they suppressed name, picture, background, and so on. The number of women who were picked for the interviews went up to 54%. Now, I could understand a small jump, but it went from 5 to 54% at kind of like a blind audition. And so then I was like, is there really that much bias in there that people are really not aware of? And I discovered this study, and it discovered that there is such a thing, and it's called brilliance bias, and it starts in really young children. So there was a study done where a group of 5-year-olds were told about a story about someone who was really, really smart, and they were given 4 photographs, 2 women, 2 men, and said, pick out who you think is the smart person. And at the age of 5, girls were more likely to pick the women, and boys were more likely to pick the men as being really, really smart. So everyone associated brilliance with their own gender. They did the same experiment with 6 and 7-year-olds, and girls were far, far less likely to pick women as being the smart ones. So by the age of 6 and 7, already the gender stereotypes around which gender is more intellectual had already set in. They tried another study where they gave 2 games for the children to choose, and they described, there's nothing special about the games or anything like that. They just described the first game as being for really, really smart people, and the second game for people who tried really, really hard. At the age of 5, girls and boys were equally likely to pick either game. At the age of 6 and 7, girls were far less likely to pick the game for really, really smart people. They shied away from it and picked the one for people that tried really, really hard. What is so significant about the age of 6 and 7? Well, that's when kids start school, and that's when the external gender stereotypes around intellectualism start entering their minds. I found this really fascinating and thought, I'd share it. If you look at Google's career database, I think, which is one of the largest career databases in the world, they have the most extensive list of all the careers in the world that are associated by both men and women, and that's how they break it down. The number one career associated with women is homemaker, and the number one career associated with men is maestro, which I found strange. Okay. And these are the next top 6. Philosopher, socialite, captain, nanny, architect, and receptionist. And I will let you guess which ones are associated with women and which ones are associated with men. And you go, well, okay, so there's a career database and it's gender disaggregated. Okay, what's the big deal? If you go to Google Translate, which uses this careers database, Turkish is a gender-neutral language. There is no he or she. Everything is just O. But if you put Turkish into Google Translate, I don't know if they fixed it yet, but let's see. Google Translate takes it upon itself to actually attach a gender to the career. She is a cook. He is an engineer. He is a doctor. She is a nurse. He is a cleaner. She is a police. He is a soldier. She is a teacher. Which I found just, again, fascinating that it's out there. And, okay, so what is so significant about this? In the next 10 years, at least the U.S. is heading in a direction where over 60% of resumes will never see human eyes. There are tons of software companies out there that want to help companies go through the millions of resumes that they get and then select what they think is the right candidate. Of course, no one is sharing their secret sauce of how they pick the right candidate, but Google's career database and other career databases out there are being used as data points to feed these AI systems. And artificial intelligence always amplifies the problem. So if a company is looking for an awesome developer and the AI systems see a resume of a male engineer and a female engineer, I don't know, I can't predict, but based on the stereotypes that are already being fed into the system, who knows which resume they're more likely to present to the recruiter. One can only guess. Gender pay gap. I'm not going to talk too much about this. The data is out here. They surveyed 10,000 plus tech employees. The biggest gender data gap exists for younger women. Between the ages of 18 and 25, women make 29% less than what male colleagues make. But past the age of 50, that gender pay gap actually decreases to about 5%. So yay. If we stick to the tech industry and wait till we're 50, we can almost make as much as men do. Except that 40% of women leave tech companies after 10 years compared to 17% of men. There was a huge study done by the Center of Talent Innovation asking women why they leave tech industries, and it was not for family reasons, and was not because the women didn't like their jobs. The top reasons were workplace conditions and social environment at work, undermining behavior from colleagues and managers, a sense of feeling stalled in one's career, repeatedly passed up for promotion, and had their projects dismissed. These were the top 5 reasons given for why women don't stick around in the tech industry. And it's usually around workplace conditions and their social environment and, not being promoted. Well, then we think, okay, well, if women leave the tech industry, maybe they'll create some startups of their own, except that women-led startups only raised 2.2% of venture capital investment in 2018. These are some of the top ones that I found. The Muse is a career website that's targeted for women. It provides, how to do salary negotiations, job descriptions that are targeted towards women and written in a way that women are more likely to apply. The Lily is a news website started by a group of ex-Washington Post reporters who recognize the gender bias in the way news is generated and reported, and so they created a website that's targeted for women, that presents news in a way that women can digest. Misfit, I thought, was a really nice idea. It actually buys ugly fruits and vegetables, the kinds of vegetables that most grocers don't want to stock because consumers won't buy them. And they buy the ugly ones in order to reduce waste, and they make delicious fruit juices and vegetable juices out of them. And so these are really great ideas. Not all of them are targeted for women, but they are all founded by women. And I've actually talked to the CEO of the Muse, and she was telling me how difficult it is to walk into rooms full of venture capitalists who are primarily men and convince them that something like this is a good idea. And so it's tough out there for women-led startups. And I will end with the biggest gender data gap of them all, in my opinion, and that is the GDP, the gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is one of the key indicators of the economic health of a country. If economics was a religion, GDP would be its god. This concept was actually created after the Great Depression, when governments wanted a way of tracking, how the health of a country was, so that they wouldn't let another depression like that happen again. But after World War II is when the GDP really took on its current form. It calculated how much governments and businesses produce, and then comes up with a number of what the productive health of an economy is. Why do I call this the biggest gender data gap of all? Because it is very arbitrary on what goods and services actually get counted towards GDP. Millions and millions of hours of unpaid work that's mostly done by women goes completely uncounted in GDP. It was actually even debated by the economists after World War II. There's a classic textbook called The Income of Nations, where it was said that all the economists agreed that even though there is immense economic value in the work, the unpaid work that women do, we simply do not have the ability to calculate and get the data in order to calculate it, so we're just not going to count it towards GDP. People, of course, still remain unconvinced whether unpaid work should really count towards a nation's productivity. Well, this is an example. In the 1970s, the United States heralded a golden age of productivity. GDP had gone through the roof, and they were saying this is a golden age. It coincided with millions of women entering the workforce and going into work. And at the same time, it also created a bit of a chimera, where all the free work that women were doing, the unpaid work that wasn't counted towards productivity, was suddenly being counted towards productivity. For example, women were cooking for free at home, but meals that you could buy at grocery stores and restaurants and frozen foods now were counting towards GDP. Childcare is unpaid work that does not count towards GDP, but the minute you send a child to daycare, that kind of work is now counted towards GDP. Same thing with clothing and sewing and so on. And so productivity really hadn't gone up, it had just shifted. It had gone from a privatized female sphere of unpaid work to now the public sphere of paid work, which is, more male dominated, and suddenly it counts towards GDP. If you look at the unpaid work done by women, it totals to about $10 trillion per year. Women still do about 70% of the unpaid work in the world, and 90%, as high as 90% in certain countries. The GDP of India would triple if a women's unpaid work was actually calculated. I know I've thrown a lot of data, and it's not all good news out there, but I wanted to kind of end on a happy little story, which I thought was really interesting when I was doing my research. Does anybody know what this is? This is a physical representation of a hyperbolic plane. A hyperbolic plane in Euclidean geometry is where a surface constantly curves away from each other at every point. For decades, mathematicians were trying to build physical models to represent the hyperbolic plane. Some used paper and duct tape, modeling clay, and so on, but they could never accurately capture it. There's a mathematician called Diana Taimina, I think. She's now a professor at Cornell University. She was attending a talk in New York, and she was watching these mathematicians display the physical models of hyperbolic planes. And she was just like, oh, these are terrible. And she had an idea that she could do a better job. Diana had learned to crochet when she was growing up in Latvia, and crocheting actually lends itself to be able to build a model that curves away from itself. And so she actually introduced this in the 90s, and this is actually appearing in textbooks, geometry textbooks, and is considered to be one of the most accurate physical models of hyperbolic planes. And I thought it was a fun story because it was, for decades, mathematicians have been trying to solve this, and it took, a woman's perspective and a skill that a woman was more likely to have than a man. I'm sure there are men who crochet and crochet well, but it took that to actually, solve a problem that was haunting mathematicians for decades. So, and I thought this was really pretty, and she has several pictures of this in pink, and yeah, so that was it. I know I've thrown a lot of data out there. This is only like 10% of the gender data gap. There's tons I would love to talk about, like meritocracy and the gender data gap in urban planning, but it takes a lot of time. But I think the reason for my talk today was just to kind of raise an awareness that there is a gender data gap in every aspect of planning and product design and economic health of countries. And I think more people are aware about this, then while we make decisions and decide to include different perspectives, that people will understand that to account now for a gender data gap and think more collectively and more diversely. So yeah, that was it. Does anyone have any questions?